everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Data Privacy for the Information Management Practitioner, Practical Advice for Preparedness and Prevention. My name is Teresa Resick, and I'm the Vice President of Market Intelligence here at AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of today's event. And joining me today are Kevin Crane, who's also with AIIM, and John Montagna from Montagna & Associates. Access is the underwriter of today's webinar, and we thank them very much for their support. And thank you for taking the time to join us today. And as we get started, I just want to offer a few tips for participating in today's webinar. Because you're joining live, you can resize the different windows you have in front of you. You can open group chat so that you can message with each other and also with a few of us here at AIIM. Please say hello and share where you're joining us from. It's nice to know who's out there. Feel free to download the resources that we have for you. And also ask questions of our speakers as you think of them. Do that in the Q&A feature, and we'll do our best to get to all of them later in the webcast. We're going to have about 5 or 10 minutes set aside towards the end to take your questions. Also, I have a survey in there that will launch at the very end of the webinar, but you're welcome to take it at any point. And I truly value your feedback on how we did today. And the link to that survey is also in the list of icons across the bottom of your screen. And this webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted to AIIM.org's Resources Webinars page in just a few days. And now to introduce the speakers we have with us. Kevin Crane is a professional writer, technology analyst, and award-winning podcast producer. He was named the #1 enterprise content management influencer to follow on Twitter and has listeners and readers worldwide. As AIIM's content strategist, Kevin authors ebooks and infographics on a wide variety of intelligent information management and digital transformation topics. He is the producer and host of AIIM On Air podcast. And we also have with us John Montagna, and John is an attorney and the CEO of the information management consulting firm Montagna & Associates, which is an access company. In this capacity, John advises corporations, law firms, and nonprofit organizations on records and information management. He's a published author and is widely recognized as one of the foremost records management experts in the country. And right now, I am going to turn things over to Kevin Crane to begin our talk today. Kevin?
Thank you, Teresa. Thanks so much. It's my pleasure to once again be part of AIIM's continued program of webinars. And today's subject is an important one. Data security and compliance are on the minds of C-suite leaders in all industries, and it seems like every week there's another high-profile data breach, and some of the world's most tech-savvy companies are falling victim. In 2019, last year, 2.7 billion identity records were exposed by hackers and placed for sale on the internet. Perhaps the most publicized breach involved Facebook. Remember that? They were already under scrutiny with how they handle privacy, but they had a hack that exposed the personal information of nearly 50 million users. So a big one. But Facebook was not alone. Quest Diagnostics, Capital One, these are just some of the top 10 hacks of last year. So even the biggest organizations are falling prey to data privacy issues. In 2020, just so far in January, again, another marquee brand, Microsoft, reported on January 22nd, just about a month ago, that 250 million customer service records and support records going all the way back to 2005 were breached. Jeff Bezos, Amazon CEO, his phone was hacked by a video file sent from a Saudi crown prince. That's another story. But they gained access to Jeff Bezos' entire phone. But if you think it's only big organizations like Amazon or Microsoft that are in the line of fire, small and more humble organizations are also at risk. Klamath County here in Oregon, where I am from, Klamath Falls, if you're familiar, is a small town with a small mining and forestry town. They had an incident in January that they're still trying to figure out the scope and implications and where that may indeed reach from beyond there. So clearly no organization is safe from the potential threat. Yet at the same time, data privacy legislation worldwide has become increasingly strict. We're all familiar with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, but there are other similar statutes across the globe. And many guidelines that don't have the force of law are also considered best practices. I was just reading this morning, the state of Maine is looking at an opt-in privacy program for the state of Maine. So the expectations are ever evolving, and perception is everything in the eyes of the market. Remember the Target data breach in 2013, one that sort of, well, I don't know if it started it all, but it was kind of the harbinger of all of this. It cost Target millions to remediate that hacking event, but also millions in the eyes of customers in the market. And my guess is that analysts and executives at Target will tell you that they have still yet to fully recover from that incident. So data privacy is an increasing challenge, if not for those reasons, also because of the volume, velocity, and the variety of information that we have to deal with every day. And in many cases, which has outstripped our ability to effectively manage it. Our own AIIM research this year tells us that organizations anticipate the volume of information coming into their organizations will grow by 2.5 times in the coming year. More than that, 60% of that information is unstructured. So as a result, organizations are embracing technologies and approaches that help to automate governance and compliance, and they're spending. According to AIIM research, again, 51% of organizations say they are planning to spend more or a lot more on information governance in the next 18 to 24 months. And in most cases, those are six-figure, up to $500,000 investments. So data privacy will cost you. The upshot of all of this is that breaches in data security are, in fact, inevitable and costly. Experts tell us that it's not a matter of if we're going to get hacked, but when. And if you think about it this way, scientists tell us that the chances of being struck by lightning are about 1 in a million. But security analysts and security scientists tell us that the chances of your organization getting hacked this year are about 1 in 4. And if it happens, it'll cost you. The average cost of a single data breach is estimated at nearly $4 million. And as I mentioned, that calculation can certainly be much higher when you start factoring in legal expense, fines, and penalties, and the loss of goodwill in the market. So that brings us to today. Are we ready? And that's what we're here to talk about. Practical steps to take to design and implement an effective data privacy program. In a moment, we'll have John Montagna join us to discuss the specific and tactical ways to move forward today. But for now, my recommendations from a strategic level are to have and implement a formal approach. Data privacy and information governance should occupy the same strategic space at the C-level as other foundational strategies like marketing and product development and sales. They should have the same type of executive sponsorship and cross-functional buy-in that are essential and required in those areas to be successful. So have a plan and stick to it. Place privacy and security of information on the front burner of strategic concerns. And then an important thing to keep in mind is to regularly review and evaluate and update your plan as needed. You can bet that hackers and cyber thieves are continually refining their methods and their attacks. So we all must be vigilant and consistent in our efforts and not be lulled into a false sense of security. This is especially important, an important mindset from the strategic and executive level. In other words, we did our privacy program a couple of years ago. Why do we need to mess with it now? That kind of thing. So regularly review and evaluate and update your plan. And as I mentioned, place privacy and security on the front burner of strategic concerns and engage and understand what some of the best practices in data security are today. Which brings me to our guest, John Montagna, as Teresa mentioned, Vice President of Governance at Access and CEO of Montagna and Associates. He's an expert in data privacy and designing programs that work. John, welcome to the event today. We hear a lot about the legislative pressures regarding data privacy, and many of our listeners will no doubt be familiar with many of the statutes and requirements. But you say that legislators often don't fully understand how large companies work with information. What do you mean by that?
Well, good morning. First of all, thank you for being here. It's good to be here with all of you, and thank you all for attending. I hope you find this to be an interesting and instructive session. So when we talk about legislation, there are some key things you have to remember as kind of starting points. The first one is that legislatures are typically composed of lawyers and folks like lawyers. And what that means is that they are, and not only are the legislators, whoever they may be, lawyers and other folks of that milieu, but so are all of their assistants and staffs and so forth. They come from a particular kind of background quite typically. That's important to us because one thing they are not is IT experts and information experts. Rarely do you find a lot of that sort of technical expertise in those areas. And that really matters because when they're drafting these laws, it's important to bear in mind that these laws are not drafted by technical experts. So that's an initial starting point that we always have to bear in mind. The second thing to bear in mind that we're increasingly realizing is that they mean it. That when they impose these requirements on you, however challenging they may be to implement in your organization, they mean it that you should comply, whatever that may take and whatever that means, and they carry a big stick. So if you look at the GDPR in Europe, one of the things that you see is that they are fining organizations very, very large amounts of money when they find violations of privacy laws. So you have to take it seriously, and organizations are certainly taking it seriously. And likewise, the CCPA and other laws in the United States, there is a real concern that there is going to be real liability because there are enforcement provisions which give both the government and individual consumers a big stick to enforce it with. So we have to take it seriously. A third thing that we have to bear in mind when we think about these things is that we talk about privacy and data security and information governance as though they're different things, but they're not. They're facets of a single conundrum, a single problem that we have to solve. So when we talk about everything that we're going to talk about today, we want to think about information governance and data security and data privacy as all being different facets of a single larger problem that has to be solved, and ultimately as different facets of a solution. So what do we have to think about bearing all that in mind? Well, first of all, a thing we have to remember is that there's a lot of jurisdictions in the world, and that means a lot of law. You know, there are, depending on how you count it, 250 or 300 countries in the world, and an increasing number of them have privacy laws and data security laws, and again, with that big stick. But within the United States, there are 50-plus jurisdictions. The United States isn't one big country. It's actually 50 little countries, plus some territories, plus some sovereign Native American nations and some other things. So it's 50-plus jurisdictions, each of which can make, and often do make, their own privacy and data security laws, just as California is doing with the CCPA. So that's a lot of laws. And the world map of where there's a law and where there's not a law changes virtually daily. Kevin was talking earlier about seeing some stuff just this morning, and that literally happens. If you follow this kind of thing, literally on a weekly basis, there are changes. So there's a lot of law, and the law is changing very rapidly. Now, all of that creates a lot of problems because just keeping up with the new laws is a challenge. But the old laws typically don't go away. So one of the challenges you have is taking these old laws, which may have their own requirements, and pounding them into this new paradigm where they interact with newer laws, such as privacy laws or data security laws, and create additional challenges. Oftentimes, that creates conflicts, and particularly if you are multi-jurisdictional, particularly if you do business in some place like Europe that has very, very strict privacy laws, and the United States, you will run into conflicts both in terms of retention requirements versus privacy requirements, what you can and cannot do with the data, who can and cannot see it, and 100 other things. And even within Europe, there are conflicts because places like Germany impose very strict requirements and enforce them very strictly. Other countries, not so much. And even within Germany, each of the German provinces has its own privacy laws. So you get a very complex matrix when you start mapping all of this out, okay? And so now you have, if you think about what you got right now, you got laws that were written by non-technical folks, which is to say non-IT, non-IG folks. You've got lots and lots of laws in lots of different places, and that mix of laws churns continuously. And now you, Madam IT professional and Madam IG professional, are sitting here trying to impose all of this on a really gigantic IT system. And it's an IT system that is part new, part old, part everything in between, part well configured, part not so well configured. So you have, and of course there are multiple media formats, there are multiple repositories. So your challenge is to take these hundreds, maybe thousands of requirements that are both data privacy requirements, data security requirements, and other kinds of requirements, general tax requirements or HR requirements or whatever they may be, and try and figure out a general strategy that's going to work in a really large, complex environment that may not be well suited for doing all of this. That is your initial challenge.
Now, John, you mentioned, it's interesting to note that these laws are, as you mentioned, are not created by IG experts, yet they have very serious implications. What are some of the considerations that information management professionals must deal with that legislators miss in the mix?
Well, it's important to think about how these legislators view these things and what they contemplate you doing. So you take something like the CCPA, for example, or the GDPR, because they both have a requirement that says that you, upon request from a consumer or another affected individual, they have the right to have their personal information deleted from your system. Okay? And that sounds good, and it is good. I think on a conceptual level, we can agree that that's an important privacy consideration, that if we don't want our information out there being used by organizations, we should be able to say that they can't do that. They should delete it. That's great. But the requirement assumes that you can reach out into a really massive information system that may have hundreds of petabytes of information in it, even exabytes these days, and with scalpel-like precision, identify the information related to a particular person in this gigantic system and somehow precisely excise it from the system. Boy, that's asking a lot. Right, and that doesn't even think about your physical records, which may reside in boxes. They may reside still in physical filing systems, things you may have on microfiche, and so on and so forth. And the thing about this is that even in an ideal situation, just combing through these petabytes of information would be enormously challenging. But when you think about the fact that almost certainly most of your IT systems were designed and built and configured and installed before all of this became relevant, you've got a real challenge because these systems are in no way optimized to do all of these things. And so you're asking a system to do something it was never really designed to achieve. And that's a big challenge, right? And then you look at the real world and you see that even newer systems, as newer systems come online, manufacturers and designers are consciously attempting to make them privacy compliant because that is such a big issue. And there's a concept called privacy by design, which says, among other things, that an IT system should be designed in the first place to manage all of these compliance issues, and that way you have less problems. But one of the things you see in the real world is that rarely is the trouble taken to fully configure them for privacy compliance. So even when the capability's there, the metadata was not correctly attached. The data structures were not correctly developed, and the kinds of things that would make this really effective aren't even there when the capability's there. So, and of course, the bottom line of all of this is when you're dealing with massive amounts of data, particularly semi-dark data, which much data is, unscrambling that sausage, unscrambling that egg is an enormous challenge. So you have a problem of having to do a backfile conversion of a sort that is very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve.
All right. Well, my next question is, how do I do it when it comes to developing a privacy program? Let's talk about specific steps to build a plan. You say it's important to start with a thorough understanding of the current capabilities within the enterprise. I worry about that. Isn't that just more analysis paralysis?
Well, it certainly can be. And one of the things you have to be cognizant of in a situation like this is that the problem can look overwhelming. And oftentimes there's a tendency to substitute meetings for action because, if you have a meeting and talk about it, it sounds like you're doing something. It feels like you're doing something, but you're not really doing something. So you have to have continuous forward motion. Okay? But that said, one of the worst things you can do, and you see this a lot in the IT business, is moving forward before you have an action plan. And a good example of that I've seen a lot in my career is the purchase and going live of a big IT system of some sort without actually having a metadata scheme and data structures and so forth in place, so that it becomes a failed installation. And you see that a fair bit, right? And so you don't want to do that here. Because if you start out with a bad situation and you move forward without thinking it through, you're liable to end up with a worse situation. And then when the California folks or the European data privacy authorities come after you, you will be punished for that error. Okay. So what do you have to do? Well, first of all, you have to figure out what it is you're trying to do, which is harder than you might think. It's pretty easy to say, well, we're going to implement privacy for our customers. But thinking about what that means on a nuts and bolts level, what does that mean with respect to the configuration of our information systems? What does that mean about our policy for what information we collect and who's going to be able to see it and what we're going to do with it? All of that becomes very complicated, particularly in a large distributed environment, and particularly when, as most of us do, we're sharing that information with vendors and business partners who do all sorts of things for us. So you really have to think through that web of interfaces and come to understand what that thing is and what we're trying to achieve with it first, right? That's step number one. Second of all, knowing that, you have to develop some sort of framework. You cannot move forward without a framework because, one, you're not going to solve this problem all at once, right? This is not a project. This is dozens of projects, maybe hundreds of projects over a period of years, right, if you're in a big environment. So you have to develop a framework and roadmap that, first of all, defines your outcomes. We have to make a decision about what our end state is going to look like, at least provisionally. Then you have to start looking at what it's going to take to get there in terms of sequential steps, in terms of the resources necessary, in terms of whatever external factors we have to factor in, such as the kind of data we're collecting, the laws that may affect that data, the other business considerations that may affect that data. And then you have to build that into a project plan. And it's going to be a big old project plan, and it's going to have lots of little sub-projects. But ultimately, without that project plan, you can't move forward because you don't have a rational thought process for moving forward. And again, as I said, I can't emphasize this enough. The last thing you want to do is move forward without understanding what you're trying to achieve in some considerable detail. So now you got a project plan. Now who's going to do it? And this is another place that you commonly see people getting lost because, yes, we're going to do something, but nobody's responsible for doing. So somebody has to have the right to pull the trigger. Somebody's got to have the responsibility of pulling the trigger for everything that's going to happen here. And somebody's got to have both the right and the responsibility for commanding the resources that are necessary to achieve our goals. So all of that has to be upfront, or you're never going to get any place, particularly in a large environment. You could sort of maybe wing it in a very, 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 very tiny little environment. But if it gets very big at all, you're going to need all of these things, or you're setting yourself up for failure. And then finally, you have to communicate that to all of the many stakeholders who are going to be involved in this. And it's worth emphasizing that there will be many, many stakeholders, from your board of directors to your employees, to your business partners, to your vendors, to your customers, and whoever you're collecting information from. So all of these people need to be on board and believing in what you're trying to achieve and understanding what you're trying to achieve. And then lastly, you got to go find some money, because this is going to be an expensive long-term proposition. And again, one of the things you don't want to do, and that you often see, is organizations that kind of fund it on a year-to-year basis. We often see this with IG initiatives, where one year there's money, the next year they change priorities and it's out of gas and nothing happens. You can't afford to do that. Not with the stakes the way they are these days, not with the kinds of penalties they're handing out. You're going to have a firm foot on the accelerator. And one of the things that means is you have to have a 5 or 6 or 10-year budget plan to make sure that this thing moves forward expeditiously.
All right. So I've got my plan. I've done a technical assessment. I've got my plan. What are some of my next steps from here in actually moving forward and getting some things done?
Well, there's a lot of stuff you got to do. Now that we're in place to actually run a play, we got to run a play, right?
Yes.
Right now, we've just been building a playbook up to
right.
now. And so what we have to do is a whole series of things. First of all, we've got to figure out what personal information we have and where it is. That's a fundamental step, because at the end of the day, the law requires you to, and your plan assumes that you will go out here and reach this information and touch it and do some things with it and manage it. So if you don't know where it is, you can't do that. And if you don't know what it is, you can't do it. So one of your first activities has to be beginning to identify where that information is and what it is and what business utility it has. All of that's going to be important, because if you don't do that, one, you can't identify the legal requirements that it may be subject to, and that's very, very important. But you also can't build a strategy that could, because it's important to bear in mind that privacy and data security and all of these things are very good, but at the end of the day, we're collecting information to use it for something, and we don't want to get in our own way and step on our own feet by creating a program which impairs the utility of our information, right? Not beyond the point that we need to comply with the law. Sometimes that happens where its utility is limited by law, and if that happens, that happens. But we don't want that to happen when it doesn't need to happen. So we need to know what we're using this information for, so that we can build a case, if necessary, for keeping it for some period of time, and that often comes up. So the first thing is find your information. Okay. The second thing is start getting your people on board. Because, as I said, you're going to need a lot of people to do a lot of stuff. And in the course of getting your people on board, you may identify some skill sets that you maybe don't have in-house that you're going to think about getting someplace. Either you hire them, or you hire vendors or business partners, or whatever the case may be. But you need all of these people to understand what's expected of them and make sure that they can actually do the things that are expected. Then you got to, one of the basic things you got to do as a matter of legal compliance is to get a privacy policy up there. You will need one, and that will do two things. One, that will give you some bare bones legal compliance, but it'll also tell you some things you have to do, because if you're posting a legally compliant privacy policy, it will obligate you to do some things, right? And they may well be things that you can't do right now. And so one of the things that you want to do is when you develop that privacy policy, have a good hard look at it and talk to all of these stakeholders. And again, there'll be many from your phone personnel to your IT department. Make sure that they understand what's expected of them, and make sure that you have some understanding of how they're actually going to comply with it, because some of the compliance things may force technical changes on you. They may force business process changes on you, and everybody needs to be aware of those things and be ready for those changes. Kind of concurrently with that, you do all of the other stuff, because there are privacy notices and signage and all of these other things that go with that. That kind of goes with your privacy policy and with developing all of the other stuff. So you got to think about that. The next important thing you really got to do is begin to chop the pile down to size. A privacy policy, a privacy program is one of the best reasons in the world to have a retention schedule, because by definition, you shouldn't be keeping anything longer than needed. So if you don't have a retention schedule, you don't know what that means, because your retention schedule is a place that defines that. But if you're not implementing your retention schedule, by definition, you're keeping it longer than you think you should. And one, that's a legal compliance issue. But number two, everything else being equal, the smaller your data set is, the cheaper and easier it's going to be to do these things. So, and I can tell you from reading the case law that the European authorities are aggressively enforcing private retention schedules. They are expecting you to enforce your retention schedule. So one of the things you want to do, both as a compliance matter and an implementation matter and a cost control matter, is to take that retention schedule. If you don't have one, get one. If you do have one, implement it ruthlessly and cut the pile down to size. It cuts down your risk, it cuts down your cost, it gives you a greater legal compliance, and it looks good, because you can tell people, we are purging your data in a timely fashion when it's no longer necessary. So that's all very important. And then finally, think about business processes. Businesses often collect information that they don't need and that isn't required for any business purpose and isn't required for any legal compliance purpose. One of the places you want to have a good hard look is what you're collecting and why. And if you don't need it, don't collect it. That's another place that, again, gives you better legal compliance, saves money, saves time, makes your processes more efficient, and is just a general good thing. So look at that very hard, make the adjustments you need when you're doing all this.
Now, John, I know that one of the things that often comes up in our discussions with AIM members is they're struggling sometimes to get a seat at the table, at the C-suite table, if you will. And I'm curious, once I have a plan, now I've got to sell it, not only to my company executives, but also to other stakeholders, my coworkers. People have to adopt the techniques and the systems. Can you outline some success tips for gaining that type of support and buy-in?
I think there are a number of them. First of all, it's a lot easier with the C-suite these days, thank goodness. Things like the GDPR and CCPA and the enforcement actions under the GDPR particularly have made that conversation with the C-suite a lot easier, because the money that is at stake with some of these fines is C-suite kind of money. And that's made that conversation a little easier. But you still have to shake loose the money. You still have to shake loose the support. It's not enough that the board of directors and the executives are scared. They actually have to support you. So now that they're scared, you need to educate them. They need to understand what it's going to take, and that goes back to our high-level project plan, because you're going to need resources, you're going to need budget, and you're going to need time. So there's an education process by which you can inform them that, yes, this is a big problem, but yes, we can solve it over time if we have a plan and if we have support for that plan and if we have budget for that plan. So that's the C-suite message that yes, we know it's a big problem. Here's how you solve that problem. Okay, you can leverage other people in that conversation, because your legal department and your external counsel are certainly aware of that these days. Your compliance and risk folks are certainly aware of that these days. Even as we're looking at this chart on the screen here, the HR folks are aware of that these days too, particularly if you have any sort of European operation. HR records are highly implicated in the GDPR. And your HR folks in Europe will be very significantly aware of how they are implicated in the GDPR, and they'll be very mindful of their responsibility. So all of these folks, the assurance groups, the legal risk, the legal audit, compliance and risk guys, and the HR guys, will be your allies in having that conversation with the C-suite, because they are in the trenches fighting this battle in one way or another, and they're going to be aware of the risks, and many of them will be aware of the costs and the roadmap, if you like, of achieving success. The next outfit you got to talk to is the IT department, and you're going to have some hard discussions with them, because a lot of this is going to fall on them, and a lot of it is going to fall on them in a way that is not going to make them happy, because you're expecting them to do some very complicated things. And as we said, their IT systems may not be ideally configured to achieve those things, so they're going to have to do some heavy lifting in a tough environment. So you need to be their partners. It's important to bear in mind that we're all in this together. Everybody on this chart and a lot of people that aren't on this chart are in this together. So you need to talk to the IT department as co-equal problem solvers to see what we can achieve in the real world. And it's important to bear that in mind too as we go through this, that your real world results are likely to be suboptimal, particularly in legacy systems. Be honest with the IT department. Let them be honest with you. Have a good, frank discussion about what we can really achieve in our environment, in the short term and in the long term, and let's shoot for that. Let's not shoot for a platonic ideal that we can't achieve, okay? And then you get to all these other folks, right? Everybody else is involved, as I say, and they all need marching orders as well, because everybody's got a hand in this. And it's worth mentioning, there's a privacy officer on this chart, and that's a good example of something Americans may not be familiar with. If you have a European presence, you have to have a privacy officer. And they are like your internal cop, is what they are, because they have a lot of authority and a lot of autonomy. And they're going to tell you what to do. You're not going to tell them what to do, right? Is how it works. They are like an ombudsman. And the net result of that is you're going to have to work with that privacy officer, find out what they need, how they see the law, how they see your compliance, and work with them to develop a strategy that they find acceptable, that you can live with. And then, of course, you got everybody else. At the end of the day, all of this has to flow out to a whole bunch of third-party contractors. Some of them will understand entirely because they're subject to the same kinds of considerations. Others may need to be brought on board because maybe they don't do business in Europe and they're unfamiliar with this kind of thing. But one way or another, you're going to have to have a dialogue with each one of them, because the reality is that if you hand over information to them, their wrongdoing, their bad practice is attributed to you, and you can be liable for it. So you have to bear that in mind. And finally, be prepared to work with the regulatory agencies. In Europe, you have to work pretty closely with the regulatory agencies in each country to make sure everything is on point and working. So be prepared to have extended dialogues with lots of different folks. So let's think about what we have to do to talk about new actors and new training. We want to go briefly here because I don't want to get us out of time, but you're going to have to train. Okay, particularly if your personnel are American personnel and they're not familiar with this stuff. European personnel are, but it's important to bear in mind that everybody is going to have to get up to speed on what the requirements are and make sure that the correct things are happening. So without belaboring it, let me just say that you need to identify everybody that needs training, which is going to be pretty much everybody. You're going to have to identify the kind of training they should get, and don't forget that refresher training. Nagging is an important part of making sure people do stuff. Keep it simple. And make sure everybody understands their roles and responsibilities.
All right. Well, one thing is certain, the rate of change is not going to slow down. How can we design our privacy programs so that they'll be flexible and adapt to changes in regulations and technologies and market expectations, all of that?
First thing to bear in mind is bear in mind that the legislation will change. There's, as we said before, there's new legislation coming online virtually daily in the world, and existing legislation changes, and so that's in constant flux. Likewise, your information systems and information processes are always in flux as well. One of the things you want to do is be very proactive if you are moving to a new system, or you are bringing a net new system online or anything like that. That's your easiest and cheapest way to begin compliance. Remember, privacy by design. It's building it in the first place to be privacy compliant. And then, that aside, you just got to keep plugging away. It's eating the elephant one bite at a time. It's bearing in mind that the elephant is moving and keeping up with it. And it's that continual forward movement that is going to make a difference. No one thing is going to be the game changer. It's just a matter of continual forward movement, continual monitoring of results, and continual adjusting of our course of action. Bottom line, understand what you're after. Set your expectations correctly and set them realistically. Okay. Understand what's possible and what's not possible. That's very important. No amount of money will solve an impossible problem. Make sure that you're achieving real results with your limited time and budget and personnel. Okay. Make sure you make your case to your C-suite, because that budget isn't going to happen if you don't make the case. Make sure you understand what that case is and the implications of that case. And then finally, just don't expect anything to be static. This is a moving environment and a rapidly moving environment. So you always have to keep your ear to the ground and listen for what's happening.
All right, very good. John Montagna from Access. Tell us a little bit more what's happening with Access.
Great, yes. Well, a lot of you probably are familiar with Access from their inactive storage activities, and we certainly are one of the largest inactive storage organizations in the world. We have 33,000 plus customers, and we are in many parts of the world, and we have 2,500 employees. And of course, we do box storage. But it's important to remember that, and I am a representative example of this, we do much more than just store boxes of records. We have complete information lifecycle management. We have a full suite of software products in the information governance space. We have a whole staff of folks like myself who are experts in this business and chomping at the bit to help you out with any information governance problems you may have, including privacy problems. And all of that, and I am proud to say this as a new member of Access, is in an organization that really truly is committed to exceptional customer service. We take great pride in the fact that our clients and customers like us, and that we go out of our way and go the extra mile for them. And that has made us one of the fastest growing companies in the Inc. 5000. And so bottom line is we're here for you. We can do everything in the information life cycle, from storing those boxes to developing that retention schedule and that privacy policy. So give us a shout.
Thank you. We've been listening to John Montagna, and here's some contact information. And I know we're getting close to running out of time on this, but there was so much good information that John was sharing, I didn't want to interrupt him on this. Before we take a couple of questions, I just want to mention a couple of things real quickly. Some people were asking, some of the questions that have come in have been about more specifics about learning about building different types of retention schedules, retention and disposition schedules. And one of the things that I just wanted to mention out here, that AIIM is offering some discount on our training through the end of this week. It's a Leap Day offer that we have, that you can take 40% off of any of our training programs. Just use the code LEAPYEAR when you go online and sign up for one of these things. The offer is good until February 29th. AIIM.org/training is where you go to get a list of everything that we have. And I can say that one of the programs that we offer is Modern Records Management. And it's very recently updated. Our training team did an excellent job with assembling all the latest information in there with Modern Records Management. And that's a really good course to consider that dovetails in with everything we're talking about. very specifically with everything that we're talking about. But there's also the Foundations of Intelligent Information Management, which is another really good overview kind of a course. Just wanted to mention this specifically to you, just to let you know that that's there. One other thing, just to let you know, AIIM conference is just around the corner, and we actually have a few slots left, so it's not too late to register to attend. It's 3 full days. There's over 150 sessions to choose from, roundtables, interactive roundtables, keynote sessions, solution presentations. I know John and a number of people from not only Montagna and Associates, but also Access are going to be there. And John specifically will be speaking there and conducting a session. And John, did you just want to mention real briefly what it is you're going to be talking about at the AIIM conference?
More privacy stuff, as well as anything else. I just wanted to, going back to the question about retention schedules, if that questioner happens to be at the AIIM conference, feel free to track me down. I'll talk your ear off about retention schedules. I know a lot about retention schedules, but we're going to be talking about privacy again and some of the challenges of privacy. And the nice thing is we're going to have not only a panel discussion, but we're going to have a roundtable. So we'll have the opportunity to sit down with folks such as the attendees here and have a real two-way conversation about some of the challenges here. We touch on them here, but there's a lot more depth there. And our goal at AIIM is to get far deeper into the subject of how you manage some of the stuff.
And actually, I'm going to be joining and facilitating your roundtable session. I got to look at my schedule today for the conference, and so I'm really looking forward to joining you in that discussion, you and your teammates. So come join us and talk to us at the conference, and I do know that Kevin Crane's also going to be there as well, doing what he does so well with interviewing and talking with our members. So, and I do just want to take one quick question in here, and one of the things that, and John, let me ask this of you, with regarding retention schedules, one of the things that struck me when I was listening to everything that you were talking about, and something that I've heard over time, from other experts like yourself, that no retention schedule needs to be perfect because it's so hard to get perfect because of the changes that are always going on between legislations and for your particular industry, governmental regulations, things like that. But you need to adhere to it consistently. As long as you have a schedule and follow it consistently, that's what the courts look for. Am I correct in what I've heard with that?
That's correct. Your information set is always a moving target, and legal compliance is always a moving target. And the one thing you don't want to do, particularly these days, is let perfection be the enemy of forward movement. So if you've got a retention schedule, one of the things we know, just looking at the cases from various jurisdictions, is they're not so much concerned about the retention period, particularly in Europe, where we enforce retention schedules very rigorously, but are you doing what you said you were going to do? So absolutely, develop that retention schedule. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can always revise it next year, and you should. It's a living document. But you don't want to wait for that platonic ideal before you start implementing it. So get it out there, start implementing right now. That's your best strategy by a long shot.
Well, just wanted to thank everyone for being here today. We are getting at the end of our webinar time. As I mentioned, we are recording this webinar, and AIIM will be emailing out to everybody the link so you can catch us again. There's a lot of good information we shared in here, and also be able just for you to invite your colleagues to come back and listen to this as well. Please download the resources. There is a PDF of the slides in there, so you'll have John's contact information. Feel free to reach out directly to him. That's why we share that information. And also, please take the feedback survey. And I very much want to thank our underwriter, Access. Without the support from our solution providers, AIIM wouldn't be able to bring you these free educational programs like our webinars. So thank you, Access, for your sponsorship. And as we do bring the webinar to a close, I do want to ask each of our speakers for their closing thoughts or a key takeaway. And I'm going to begin first with Kevin Crane from AIIM. And your closing thoughts.
Thank you, Teresa. Yes, I'll just harken back to what I was mentioning before. I believe that privacy and having a privacy program, as John has outlined here is a strategic imperative and should be one that is on the front burner of strategic concerns, as I mentioned, alongside things like marketing and sales and product development. So that would be my takeaway, that whatever we're doing, it certainly be on the front burner of strategic consideration.
Thank you, Kevin. And John Montagna, your closing thoughts today.
Just this, and I think it mirrors what Kevin just said. If your organization has been putting privacy compliance off, which a lot of American organizations particularly have been doing for a long time now because it's expensive, because they didn't take it seriously, whatever the case might be. If yours is one of those organizations, now's the time to do it. They mean it. And they are prepared to force you into compliance, however painful it might be for you. So if you've been putting it off, now's the time to get with it. Move forward. It's going to be painful, but it's absolutely necessary.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for your time today. For AIIM, this is Teresa Resick, and we will see you at our next event. Have a good afternoon.